I stare at the digital board long enough for the green letters to blur, the airport's fluorescent hum competing with the low rumble of rolling suitcases. My shift at the Whitmore twins' house ended just after sunrise, and the night before I'd crammed 2 days of lesson plans, snack schedules, and a half-finished budget spreadsheet into my mind like a stack of plates I never meant to drop. The gate numbers flicker, 23B for Boston, 23A for Manhattan. I stare at the stenciled letters, my thumb tracing the edge of the worn leather notebook peeking out of my bag. It's the same notebook I've carried since my mother folded a battered copy of The Little Prince into a shoebox for me after my dad left. It's the thing I write in when I can't afford to think about the emptiness that waits at the end of each workday. A woman in a navy blazer pushes past me, her shoes clicking against the polished floor. She's on a phone, her voice low but urgent, and she drops a paper-thin badge with the logo of a biotech firm onto the counter before sliding into the line. I clench my jaw, watching the way her hair catches the airline's overhead light, a copper halo so brief it seems a trick of the fluorescent. I think about the Whitmore twins, how their mother will fire me if I'm not back before noon, how their father's lawyer, one of the city's most cutthroat litigators, will be calling my name in 3 hours to discuss future opportunities that sound more like a veiled threat than a promotion. My phone buzzes with a text from the agency. Pick up at 6:30. Do not be late. Remember, we need you for the Petrov family next week. The sting of the message hits my wrist like a tiny ping. I can't afford another missed shift. I have to be here, on this plane, even if it means redirecting a life that never asked for a crossroads. The boarding announcement crackles. Final call for Flight 672 to Boston. Passengers with seats 14A through 24F. Please proceed to Gate 12. My breath catches. The plane is a narrow, silver slab of metal, its windows fogged just enough for the sunrise to paint the clouds a bruised gold that slips across the horizon. I watch the light stretch, the way it clings to the far edge of the wing like a thin line of amber. I do a quick inventory of what I'm carrying: a battered leather notebook, a lavender sachet tangled in the inner pocket of my cardigan, a habit I picked up from my mother, who swore the scent kept the house from feeling too empty, one pair of black flats, a coffee thermos that still steams faintly, and the endless list of grocery coupons I've never had time to use. My bag thuds against the metal seat as I slide into the row, the seatbelt click echoing in the quiet aisle. I pull the notebook free, its leather cracked at the corners, and flip to the page where I keep a tally of the children's moods, the weird way Ella blinked when she heard a thunderstorm, the way Jacob threw his cereal at the floor when he wanted attention. My pen hovers, then I write a quick note. Wake up call at 7:05, must be in Manhattan by 8:30. The scribble is an anchor, a tiny ritual that keeps the lingering dread of abandonment at bay. I take a sip from the thermos, the coffee warm against the chill that already seeps through the cabin's air vents. The scent of reheated coffee mingles with the faint antiseptic sting of the filtered air, a combination that makes me think of hospital lobbies my mother once worked in late at night. A man steps down the aisle, his suit cut so sharply it could cut glass, his shoes polished to a mirrored finish. He carries himself like a prowler, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to hint at a confidence that borders on arrogance. The faintest scar runs along the inside of his left wrist, like a shallow river carved into stone. He pauses by the overhead bin, eyes sweeping the rows as if searching for something or someone. His hand finds a glossy black card tucked into his pocket. He flashes it to the attendant with a nod that seems rehearsed, a practiced courtesy that doesn't quite reach his eyes. The attendant, a petite woman with a tight bun and a uniform that looks a shade too pristine, glances at the card, then at him, her mouth tightening for a heartbeat before she says, "Sir, please have a seat. We'll be boarding shortly." I watch the exchange from my window seat, my notebook now resting on my knee, the pen still poised. Something about the way his gaze lingered on the edge of the cabin, as if he were listening for a sound beyond the engine's hum, catches my attention. A faint scent of pine drifts from his jacket, the earthy smell of rain-soaked wood that feels out of place in the sterile environment of an aircraft. It's a scent I've smelled before, once, in a laundromat while folding blankets for a family I was caring for, a scent that reminded me of my mother's old coat, the one she wore when she worked the night shift. The memory makes my throat tighten, a phantom ache that twists around my heart like a silent promise of loss. My fingers tighten around the pen, the worn leather of the notebook creaking under my grip. The voice over the intercom cuts in, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to inclement weather we are experiencing a short delay. Please remain seated while we assess the situation." The cabin lights dim a notch and the low rumble of the engines seems to vibrate through the seats, a deep throbbing that matches the rhythm of my own pulse. I glance up at the man opposite me. He's still standing, his coat hanging from the back of his seat, the faint scar on his wrist catching the dim light. He does not sit. He shifts his weight, the muscles in his shoulders tightening as if bracing for something unseen. I pull the notebook shut, the soft thud of the leather echoing the sudden drop of the cabin temperature. My breath fogs a little as I exhale, the edges of the lavender sachet now tinged with the metallic scent of airplane seats. A child's crayon doodle, an accidental swirl of pink and blue, catches my eye on the back of the seat in front of me. I wonder who drew it, what story they thought they were telling with a single, hurried stroke. The mystery is a small loop, a question I will not answer now, but the image settles in my mind like a tiny bookmark. A muffled laugh from a row behind us draws my attention away. A teenage boy with earbuds shoved deep into his ears is cracking jokes with his sister, the sound of their whispered conspiracies vibrating against the thin fabric of the seat. I feel the tug between wanting to keep my head down, to disappear into the margins of this cramped space, and an odd, involuntary pull toward the man across the aisle. Something about the scar, the scent of pine, the way he seemed to assess the cabin as if measuring unseen distances, stirs a curiosity I normally keep locked behind the notebook's pages. My mind flips through the checklist of my day: collect the twins' lunch boxes, confirm the payment with the agency, call my mother before the night ends. Each item is a rung on a ladder I'm desperate to climb, yet my eyes keep drifting back, tracing the outline of his jaw, the faint line of tension in his neck. A flight attendant walks past, a tray of pretzel sticks clinking against each other. She pauses by my row, offering a smile that looks rehearsed, the kind that never quite reaches her eyes. "Anything I can get you, miss?" she asks, her voice smooth, practiced, a perfect blend of hospitality and corporate training. I nod, keeping my voice low. "Water, please." The water cup is handed to me, condensation beating on the plastic, the coolness seeping through my fingers. I take a sip, the taste of filtered water slipping over the coffee residue left on my tongue. The contrast between the bitter coffee and the bland water mirrors the tension I feel, one foot in the world of responsibility, the other teetering on the edge of an unknown. The man finally sits, the leather of his jacket sighing as he eases into the seat. He places his briefcase, a matte black thing with a faint metallic glint, on the floor beside him, the side of it catching the light just enough to reveal an intricate pattern etched into the metal, a wolf's head intertwined with a corporate logo. My eyes linger on it, the shape unsettlingly familiar, but I can't place why. He pulls out a sleek silver phone, the screen lighting up with a bright notification that reads "Urgent, pack meeting rescheduled." The word "pack" stands out, a word that conflicts with the green glow of the city's skyline outside the window, the one we're supposed to be heading toward. He bites his lower lip, a flicker of irritation crossing his face, and then he looks straight at the window, as if searching for something in the clouds. I turn back to my notebook, the pages open to a half-finished list of the twins' bedtime stories. I write a quick note about the broken lamp in the nursery, the way the new bulb flickers, and the thought of fixing it later. My pen scratches across the leather, the sound a tiny percussion in the stillness of the cabin. A gust of wind rattles the fuselage, a whisper of turbulence that seems to vibrate through the seatback, the metal frame of the plane. The faint thrum of the engines aligns with the beat of my heart, a reminder that I am suspended between earth and sky, caught in a moment where no one can see the abyss below or the destination ahead. The man across the aisle finally meets my gaze. His eyes are a steely gray, the kind of color you find in river stones after a storm, and they flicker with a hint of something else, a guarded alertness that makes my skin prickle. He says, more to himself than to me, "Travel plans rarely go smoothly," his voice low, each word measured. I let the words linger in the air before I reply. "That's why I keep a notebook. It's my way of making sure I don't lose anything or anyone." The half smile that curves his mouth is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it catches the light just enough to give it a copper sheen. We sit like that for a few minutes, the cabin a hushed microcosm of strangers bound together by metal and weather. The flight attendant returns with a cart of pretzel sticks, handing a small bag to a child in the row ahead, her eyes flitting once more to the man's briefcase, a brief sparkle of something unreadable passing over her face. The scent of pretzels mixes with the faint smell of his pine, and a small question forms in my mind: who else knows about the compacting tension that seems to coil around his shoulders like a leash? I glance at my watch. The minutes tick by, each second a reminder that I'm late, that the Whitmore twins will be waiting, that my future brushes against a horizon I have never truly wanted to see. The engines drone on, a low, steady hum that feels like a heartbeat of its own. As the plane lurches slightly, the turbulence shakes the cabin, a subtle shift that makes the lavender sachet in my pocket rustle, releasing a fleeting note of floral calm that fights the metallic taste of fear in my throat. I close my notebook, my fingers lingering on the worn leather cover, feeling the faint imprint of every pen stroke I've ever made. My mind drifts to the question of why I'm here, why the universe chose a Boston flight instead of the Manhattan one I'd meticulously planned. The answer is tangled among the threads of my past: the kids I've cared for, the mother who worked 3 jobs and never missed a shift, the promises I made to myself to never be left behind. And across from me, the man with the scarred wrist sits, his eyes still watching the clouds, his mind perhaps racing with a different set of promises about leadership, about sovereignty, about a war that could shatter the fragile peace he's been forced to keep. I hear the faint clink of his briefcase closing, a sound that feels like a lock clicking into place. The cabin lights flicker again, the storm outside shaking the plane with a low rumble that seems to echo through both of us. I pull my cardigan tighter, the lavender scent hugging me like a thin blanket. I glance at the man once more, the outline of his profile softened by the dim light, and I wonder what secrets lie behind those eyes, what battles he fights that no one else sees. My notebook remains open on my lap, the last line unfinished, waiting for a thought that refuses to surface. The plane is caught in a storm, the world beyond this metal tube a blur of gray, and 2 strangers sit inches apart, each holding a piece of a puzzle they cannot yet name. The engines settle into a steadier rhythm, the turbulence easing slightly, the cabin's hum smoothing into a low, comforting vibration. I hear a soft sigh from the man opposite me, a release of tension, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement of the unsettling atmosphere. I straighten my spine, the notebook now pressed against my chest, and turn my gaze back to the window, where the sun, now a thin crescent, peeks through a break in the clouds, casting a sliver of pale light across the rows. The world outside is still a mess of storm clouds, but for a moment, the light finds its way in, touching the edge of the notebook, the tip of the pen, the scar on the man's wrist. The moment feels like a promise, a small, unspoken agreement that whatever lies ahead, this forced proximity will change something in both of us. I let the thoughts settle, the hum of the engines a metronome for the waiting beat that will soon pull us deeper into each other's orbit. I hear the door hiss open and the soft thud of a heel against the polished aisle, the sound cutting through the low drone of the engines like a metronome striking a new tempo. A figure slides past the rows, shoulders squared, the faint click of a silver clasp echoing against the upholstery. My eyes, still half closed from the hum of the plane, snap open at the movement. The man stops just short of the exit row, his coat slipping off one shoulder as if it were an extra layer of armor he's unwilling to bear any longer. He leans against the bulkhead, the navy fabric of his jacket catching the dim cabin light and turning the fibers a deeper indigo. The scar on his left wrist catches my peripheral vision, a thin line, pale against the dark skin, like a river that once flooded a dry bed. He runs a thumb over it, the motion deliberate, almost a nervous habit. The scent that follows is unmistakable to me, though I can't name it. Pine soaked in rain, the earthy musk of a forest floor after a storm, a hint of something animalistic that vibrates just beneath the surface of the pine. My throat tightens, a flicker of recognition I can't place, and the lavender sachet in my cardigan nudges against my ribcage, releasing its soothing note in a quiet rebellion against the strange aroma. He glances up, eyes scanning the cabin as if searching for an exit that isn't there. When they land on me, the gaze is steady, measuring, and I feel the weight of it settle across the small expanse of air between us. He doesn't smile. Instead, a faint line forms at the corner of his mouth, a half-curved shadow that could be amusement or appraisal. I notice the way his jaw tightens, the barely perceptible clench of his teeth, and a flash of something else, perhaps a flicker of wariness, fires across his face before he forces it back into composure. "Seats taken," he says, voice low, the syllables rolling like gravel over a distant road. There's a faint accent, clipped and precise, that hints at a city he knows well, but not the one I'm accustomed to. He slides into the seat opposite mine, the leather sighing as his weight settles. The briefcase he places beside him clicks shut with a metallic resonance that seems to echo in the cramped space, a small, orderly sound that contrasts with the chaotic swirl of thoughts in my head. I pull my notebook closer, the leather cover warm against my palm, and let my eyes wander over the details his presence has drawn out of the cabin. The stewardess with a tight bun glances at his briefcase, her eyes flickering for a heartbeat longer than usual, then sharpening as if she's spotting a threat only she can sense. The man behind us, a middle-aged gentleman with a newspaper, shifts his weight and mutters something about crazy weather, the words lost in the hum, but his nervous tapping of the page's edge unmistakable. A child in the row ahead squeals as the flight attendant offers a tiny pretzel, the plastic bag crinkling like dry leaves. The plane shudders slightly, the turbulence nudging us like a wave against a pier. The metal fuselage groans, a low, resonant moan that seems to vibrate through my bones. A sudden gust of cold air whistles past the overhead bin, and I feel the lavender sachet rustle, releasing an extra puff of floral calm that mingles with the pine. I inhale, the mixture grounding me, and I can't help but notice the way his nostrils flare just enough for me to catch a hint of my own scent on him: baby powder, fresh laundry, the faint metallic tang of anxiety. He pulls his coat tighter around his torso, the fabric rustling softly. A silver pin catches my peripheral glance, a subtle emblem, a wolf's head intertwined with a corporate logo, the kind of detail I'd expect on a businessman's lapel, not on a creature that prowls in shadows. My mind flashes to a news article I skimmed once about a mysterious PAC lobbying in the city council, the term floating in the background of a story about zoning disputes in the old industrial district. I swallow, the act turning my throat dry, and I wonder if the scar on his wrist is more than a scar, perhaps a reminder of a past fight, a battle that left him both hardened and vulnerable. He leans forward, elbows resting on the armrests, his hands poised as if ready to spring at any moment. The way his fingers curl around the briefcase strap is precise, almost ritualistic, each movement calibrated. I catch the faint tremor in his left hand, a shaky undercurrent that betrays the controlled veneer he wears. My own hand, hidden beneath the notebook, clenches around the pen, the plastic grip paling against the steel of his resolve. "Storm's getting worse," he mutters, eyes still fixed on the swirling clouds visible through the narrow window. The lightning outside flashes a brief, jagged white, illuminating the cabin in a strobe of light that makes the metallic surfaces shimmer. In that flash, I see a glint on his cuff, something like a hidden blade, the faint edge catching the strobe's brief kiss before disappearing back into darkness. I force a grin, the corners of my mouth lifting just enough to meet his gaze without giving away the churn inside me. Looks like we're stuck together for a while, I say, the humor thin, a shield made of sarcasm. The words tumble out, landing between us, the syllables floating in the cramped air. He tilts his head, the motion deliberate, as if weighing how much of himself to reveal. Seems that way, he replies, his voice softer now. The edge of his earlier command softened into something that could be curiosity. He leans back, his posture relaxing just enough for me to see the faint outline of a tattoo peeking from under his sleeve, a series of interlocking circles that could be a family crest or a sigil. The mystery deepens, a loop I can't yet untangle. The cabin lights flicker again, a brief pulse that syncs with the thrum of the engines. A distant rumble rolls through the fuselage, the storm outside pressing its weight against the metal skin of the plane. I feel a pressure building in my chest, the same pressure that rises every time I'm forced to trust someone with a piece of my schedule, my future. My notebook lies open, the page waiting for a thought I'm not sure I'm ready to write. He reaches into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, the edges crisp, the ink dark. He folds it again, tucking it back into his coat before sliding his hand back onto the armrest. The motion is quick, almost reflexive, as if he's keeping something close, a secret he isn't ready to share. My eyes chase the movement, narrowing on the spot where his fingers brushed the leather. There's a faint smudge, like oil or blood, but the dim light refuses to give me a clear answer. A voice crackles over the intercom again, announcing that the captain is attempting to reroute around the storm. The plane will remain aloft for an indeterminate amount of time. The stewardess glides down the aisle, her smile polite, her eyes flickering to the man opposite me with a hesitation that lingers too long. She asks if anyone needs anything, her tone professional, yet the tremor in her hand as she places a cup of water on my tray is noticeable. I take the cup, the condensation beating against the plastic, and I feel the coolness seep into my palm, grounding me amidst the electric buzz of the cabin. He watches me take the water, the faint sparkle of amber in his eyes catching the dim light. Without thinking, I bring the cup to my lips, the liquid sliding down my throat, a subtle taste of metal and purification. The act feels like a small surrender, a moment where I let a stranger see my vulnerability, even if only through the tremor of my hand. Our shoulders brush as the plane lurches again, a sudden dip that sends the seatbelt hooks clicking back into place. The contact is brief, a whisper of fabric against fabric, but the heat of his skin against mine sends a current racing up my forearm, the kind of electric thrill I've felt only when a child clings to me after a nightmare. He doesn't pull away. Instead, his hand rests a fraction closer to mine, his fingers hovering just above the leather edge of my notebook, as if daring me to open it and expose the thoughts inside. I glance at the notebook, the pages half filled with schedules, observations, little jokes I've written for the twins to keep them smiling. My pen hovers, trembling. The moment stretches, the storm outside roaring louder, the plane's interior a cocoon of forced proximity where every breath, every scent, every tremor is magnified. He leans forward again, this time his voice a hushed murmur that only reaches my ear. You ever feel like the world's moving too fast, and you're just trying to keep up with a notebook? He asks, the question hanging in the cramped space, both an observation and an invitation. I let the silence sit for a heartbeat, feeling the weight of the storm outside pressing against the fuselage, the pressure of his stare steady against my ribs. My answer comes out in a whisper, the words slipping out before I can edit them. All the time, I admit, the confession slipping past the guard I've built around myself. The sound of my own voice sounds foreign in the metal tube, but it carries the honesty I've hidden behind checklists for years. His lips curve into a faint smile, the one that reaches his eyes just enough to reveal a glint of something unguarded. Then maybe we can help each other, he says, the promise in his tone layered with the unspoken an offer of alliance, a hint of something deeper, a shared survival in the eye of the storm. The plane shudders once more, the turbulence turning the cabin into a shaking cradle, and I feel the notebook's leather cover shift against my chest, as if urging me to write not just schedules but the story that is beginning without my permission. The storm outside roars, the lights flicker, and the flight attendant's eyes shift once more toward the man opposite me, a flash of suspicion crossing her face before she turns away, leaving me with the lingering question of what she's really looking for. The cabin hums, the world narrowed to the narrow space between two strangers forced to share a seat, a breath, a secret, and each of us glances at the other, wondering how long this forced proximity will hold us before the next loop, whether it be a hidden dagger, a whispered warning, or a revelation will finally snap our fragile connection open. The turbulence jolted us again, a sudden lurch that made the plastic tray on my knees tip and the lavender sachet sigh against my chest. I reached for the pen, but my fingers brushed Declan's thumb as he steadied his own cup, the contact brief as a spark yet enough to make his knuckles whiten. He didn't pull away, instead his thumb lingered, tracing a thin line along the edge of my notebook as if measuring the weight of my secrets. A low rumble rolled through the fuselage, and the overhead lights flickered, casting the cabin in a staccato of amber and shadow. I heard the flight attendant's breath hitch, her eyes darted to the metallic pin on Declan's lapel, then slid back to the aisle like a predator watching a hidden scent. A child's giggle cracked the tension, but the sound seemed to echo farther, as if the airplane itself were holding its breath. "Looks like we're really stuck," Declan said, his voice a low rasp that matched the hum of the engines. He turned his chair slightly, the leather squeaking, and pressed his forearm against the armrest, the leather of his cuff catching the dim light. A faint glint slipped out a polished edge I'd missed before, like a blade hidden beneath a tie. I forced a laugh, the sound jittery, and pulled the notebook closer, the leather warm against my palm. My notes are the only thing keeping me from flying straight. I glanced at the page, where the twins' bedtime schedule stared back in neat columns, the ink blotting where I'd pressed too hard. The pressure in my jaw relaxed a fraction. I could feel the pulse in my temples sync with the engine's thrum. He leaned forward, his breath tasting of pine and rain, and whispered, "You ever feel like a cage can be both safe and suffocating?" The words were a question and a confession rolled into one, and the scar on his wrist twitched, a reminder of a fight I could not see. I swallowed, the taste of stale coffee and metal coating my tongue, and answered, "Every time I sit down, I'm already counting the minutes until I have to get up." My eyes drifted to the doodle on the seat, back a child's shaky swirl of pink and blue, wondering who had drawn it and why it felt like a map to something I couldn't read. The plane shuddered once more, and a sharp crack of lightning illuminated the aisle. In that flash, I saw a silver dagger tucked into the galley cart, its handle catching the light before the attendant brushed past, her fingers lingering on the cold metal longer than protocol required. Declan's jaw tightened, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he kept his posture calm, eyes fixed on the storm outside. "Maybe," he said, voice barely above the wind, "we're both trying to hold on to something we think will keep us from falling." The words settled between us, heavy as the humid air that seeped through the cracks of the fuselage. I felt the notebook shift against my ribs, the pen poised as if waiting for a new line. A final shudder rocked the cabin, and the intercom crackled, "Ladies and gentlemen, we expect to land soon." The plane's descent began, the wheels grinding against the runway, a metallic sigh that mirrored the tension in my chest. I stared at Declan, his gaze steady, the promise of his hand hovering just above my notebook, and I wondered whether the next landing would be a touchdown or a crash. Maya's eyes flicked to the tray cart as it glided past, the gleam of stainless steel catching a stray flash of the cabin light. The attendant, a woman with tightly coiled hair pulled into a bun that held a stubborn sheen, set down a cup of tea beside her, steam spiraling like a muted sigh. She glanced at Declan, her smile tightening for a heartbeat before she turned to the row in front of them. Maya felt the weight of the woman's stare linger on the pin at his lapel, the tiny silver wolf head catching the dim glow. She pressed the notebook harder into her lap, the leather cold against the heat of her palm. He watched the same motion, the way her fingers trembled just enough to betray the composure she sold to every passenger. Declan's mind, usually a glass pane of strategic calculation, flickered with something else, a low, animalistic thrum that resonated with the tremor in the woman's hand. He caught the scent of her perfume, a sharp citrus that cut through the pine of his jacket, and for a split second he wondered what business she truly had on this flight. A question, half-formed, settled in the space between his ribs, unasked and unanswered. "Do you mind if I sit here a while?" he asked, voice low enough to drown in the low hum of the engines but firm enough to cut through the static. The words were a simple request, but his eyes lingered on the scar still faintly pulsing under the skin of his wrist, a reminder that every movement was being measured. Maya's smile was a quick, defensive lift of the corners. "You're already here," she said, pulling the notebook closer, the sound of the leather whispering like a promise. "Just don't start a conference with the captain." She gestured at the glowing panel displaying the altitude, a thin line of green on a black field. He chuckled, a sound that vibrated in his chest, and settled his briefcase beside his seat, the metal edges scraping against the seatback with a soft sigh. "I'm not trying to hijack the flight plan, just thought I could use a bit of company." His glance drifted to the lavender sachet peeking from the cuff of her cardigan, the floral note pulling at something he couldn't name. She opened the notebook to the page with the twins' morning schedule, the lettering neat, the ink saturated where she pressed too hard. "They're a handful," she said, tracing a line with her thumb. "If I don't get them to school on time, my boss will find a reason to replace me. And then I'm back to..." Her voice trailed, the word hanging like an unfinished knot. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes narrowing as he listened not just to her words but to the tremor underlying them. "You're always on a schedule," he observed, the observation a bridge rather than an accusation. Hard to breathe between the lines. A gasp of turbulence rattled the fuselage, the metal frame shivering, and Maya's hand tightened around the notebook until the leather creased. She swallowed, the taste of metal mingling with the lingering coffee on her tongue. "Breathing is a luxury I'm learning to give myself," she said, the sarcasm thin, but behind it a flicker of something raw, perhaps the memory of nights when the children's cries had eclipsed her own needs. He watched her, the way the furrow between her brows softened for a moment, then resumed its stubborn line. The scar on his wrist twitched, a silent echo of his own fear of being bound, of losing the autonomy he'd fought so hard to claim. "You sound like you've built walls," he murmured, voice barely above the roar of the storm outside. "Strong walls, though." Maya's eyes flicked to his, searching for something beyond the surface. "And you sound like you're trying to see where they end." She chuckled, a dry sound that made her throat constrict. "You can't just tear them down in a day, Declan." She didn't call him by his name, but the way she said it slipped out as if it were a piece of herself she was testing. He inhaled deeply, letting the pine in his jacket blend with the faint scent of the woman's perfume and the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Maybe I'm not trying to tear them down," he said. "Maybe I'm just looking for a window." The seatbelt sign pinged, a metallic chirp that seemed louder than the storm's howl. The attendant returned, her eyes flickering again toward Declan's pin, this time catching a glint of something metallic hidden under his cuff. She set a small cup of water on his tray, the condensation beating like tiny rainstorms. "Anything else?" she asked, voice smooth, but the edge of her stare lingered on the briefcase. "Just the usual," Declan replied, his hand brushing the cool glass of the cup, the water's chill sending a shiver up his forearm. "And maybe a quiet seat." He let his gaze return to Maya, noticing her fingers slide over the notebook's edge, the way the pen rested lightly, as if waiting for her to write something she didn't yet know how to say. "You ever think about what you'd do if the schedule disappeared?" she asked, a question that slipped in like a feather, weightless yet heavy with implication. He considered the moment, his mind skirting around the pack meetings, the boardroom battles, the pressure of a legacy he never asked for. I'd probably spend a lot of time looking at a ceiling, he admitted, the humor thin but genuine. Or see what it feels like to be just a man without a title. Maya nodded, the motion small, her eyes following a droplet of condensation sliding down the side of the water cup. I think I'd try to read the sky, she said, to see if I could finally tell the difference between a cloud and a storm before I have to run inside. Her voice softened, the edge of sarcasm wearing away, replaced by a quiet resonance that matched the low rumble that traveled through the fuselage. He turned his head to the window, the plane's wing cutting through the churn of clouds, the outside world a swirling mass of gray and occasional silvery lightning. He saw a flash illuminate the horizon, a brief kiss of light on the wing's edge, and felt the sudden, involuntary tightening of his jaw, a reaction that betrayed the wolf's instinct to shield against sudden brightness. Declan's thoughts, usually sharp and orderly, became a tangled web of protection and curiosity. "Do you ever feel like you're watching from the wing?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Maya laughed, a sound that seemed to crack the stale air around them. "All the time, except my wing is a hallway and the view is someone else's living room." She tapped the notebook, her thumb landing on a margin where she'd scribbled a reminder, "Buy more lavender." He caught the subtle shift in her posture, how she leaned forward, shoulders aligning with the seatback, as if willing the cramped space to become larger. "Lavender," he repeated, his tone softening. "It's good for stress." He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her cardigan, the lavender sachet tugging gently against his skin. The contact was brief, the fabric sliding over his hand, a pulse of scent that seemed to summon something primal within him, a reminder that he was more than his corporate armor. She shivered, a quick inhale that drew the scent deep into her lungs, the botanical note mixing with the metallic tang of the airplane air. "And pine," she whispered, eyes closing momentarily, "reminds me of my mother's garden after a rainstorm." The confession was a thread pulled from a hidden seam of memory, a soft crack that let a glimpse of vulnerability slip through the walls she'd built. He opened his mouth, the words forming slowly, the storm outside echoing his internal turbulence. "My mother," he began, then halted, the memory of a man whose presence loomed large and unmoving, a father figure who had died before he could ever truly know him, surfacing like a ghost. He clamped his jaw, the scar on his wrist pulsing with a dull ache. "She died before I even knew her." The admission was a fissure, the crack widening just enough for the light of his confession to spill into the cabin. "I think I've been trying to fill the space she left with orders." Maya's eyes widened, a flicker of empathy crossing her face as she saw the vulnerability he tried to conceal. She reached out, her hand hovering over his, the feather-light brush of her fingertips against his knuckles. The contact was electric, a spark that seemed to charge the air between them. "We both have ghosts," she said, voice barely above the hum of the engines. "But maybe we can be the ones who keep them from shouting." She traced a line on the notebook's page, the pen moving in a smooth arc, as if drawing a circle around their shared confession. He watched the ink settle, the way it darkened the paper, and felt a grounding sensation, as if the act of seeing his own story written beside hers gave him a foothold. "What if the ghosts keep coming?" he asked, the question edged with a fear that every step toward trust might be met by a new specter of abandonment. Maya's thumb brushed the notebook's edge, the rubbery tip of the pen leaving a faint imprint. "Then we make sure they have no room to echo," she replied, the words deliberate, each syllable a brick in the wall they were both building, not of isolation, but of shared shelter. She paused, eyeing the attendant who lingered near the galley, the woman's fingers deftly moving a gleaming dagger out of place, then slipping it back under a stack of napkins. Maya's gaze lingered a moment longer, the seed of suspicion planting a question she didn't voice. The flight attendant's eyes flicked to Declan again, this time catching the faint glint of the metallic edge on his cuff, a blade hidden, perhaps, or a decorative piece. She smiled thinly, the smile that didn't quite reach her mouth, and moved away, her steps echoing softly against the carpeted aisle. Declan caught the subtle change in her posture, the slight hesitation before she turned away. He noted the minute twitch of the needle on the compass on the back of his briefcase, a slight, almost imperceptible shift that suggested a hidden compartment opening. A thought flared, brief and dangerous. The sable pack had eyes everywhere, and a dagger meant for him could be a warning, a test, or a trap. He chose to focus on the present. You know, he said, voice softer, I used to think leadership meant never showing weakness, that if I let anyone see the cracks, they'd think I'm broken. He shifted his weight, the leather of the seat creaking under him, and glanced at the window where a bolt of lightning sliced the sky, illuminating the clouds like a sudden revelation. But now I think it means letting the right people see those cracks, so they can help you hold them together. Maya's eyes softened, the edges of her mouth lifting in a quiet smile that carried nowhere near as much sarcasm as before. You've got a lot of good ideas for someone who's been hiding a wolf inside a suit. She reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, the movement displacing a faint scent of baby powder that mingled with the lavender. It's nice to hear that after all the years I've been told I'm just a caretaker. He felt the wolf's breath inside him tighten, the animal's instinct to protect surging with a need to offer more than words. I've spent a lifetime protecting a city that doesn't know it needs protectors, he said, each syllable measured, the sound of his own heartbeat muffled by the thrum of the engines. Maybe I'm looking for a co-guardian. Maya laughed, a sound that seemed to ripple through the cabin, causing a passenger 2 rows ahead to glance up, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. Co-guardian? That sounds like a job description I signed up for when I was 18, just with less respect and more cleaning. She tapped the notebook, the pen scratching a line beneath a note. Talk about future. He inclined his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement that carried the weight of his title without the need for a formal introduction. What do you want, Maya? He asked, the question uncomplicated on the surface, but deep in the undercurrents of his mind it tugged at the fear of allowing someone into his plans, the fear that sharing would mean surrendering control. She stared at the turbulence outside the window, the clouds swirling like thoughts. I want a place where I'm not just a safety net for other people's kids. She turned back to him, eyes steady, a fire that had been smoldering beneath layers of practicality now flaring. I want to be seen for more than the person who keeps schedules. He let the words sink into his chest, the scar on his wrist pulsing like a slow drumbeat. You're already seen, he said, his voice low, by the people who matter. He reached across the narrow aisle, his hand brushing the notebook's cover, the leather cool against his skin. I think we could help each other see more. She hesitated, the instinct to pull back clashing with the yearning for connection that had been dormant for years. The sensation of his hand on the notebook felt like an invitation, a promise that the proximity they were forced into could become a bridge rather than a cage. She placed her hand over his, the pressure gentle yet firm, the overlapping of skin a silent agreement. The flight attendant returned, this time with a tray of hot soup, the steam rising in soft curls that smelled faintly of thyme and carrots. She set a bowl on Maya's tray, the porcelain warm to the touch, the broth steaming, tiny droplets pattering against the side of the cup. She glanced at Declan, her eyes lingering on the pin at his lapel a fraction longer than necessary, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking a measured rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of Maya's heart. He watched the steam rise, the scent of broth mixing with the pine and lavender, forming an unlikely perfume that hung in the small space between them. Do you ever wonder how many lives we touch without ever knowing? Declan asked, his tone thoughtful, the question stretching into the lull of the cabin. Maya lifted the soup spoon, the metal cool before warming in the broth. She took a sip, the rich flavor spreading across her tongue, the salt and vegetables grounding her. All the time, she said, but I rarely get to see the faces behind the names. She placed the spoon back, the clink bright against the porcelain. Maybe this flight is the first time I see someone's face with a name I don't have to write down. He smiled, a faint curve that softened the hard line of his jaw. My name is Declan Pierce, he said, offering a business card from his pocket, its corners sleek, the embossed wolf head catching the cabin light. And yours? She took the card, the texture of the thick stalk soft against her fingers. Maya Taurus. The words felt like a benediction, the ink dark and permanent. She slid the card into the notebook, tucking it behind a page of notes about the twins' bedtime routine. The act, small and deliberate, felt like a tether being placed. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, the lights flickering for a heartbeat, and a quiet gasp escaped from a child in the row ahead. The flight attendant's eyes darted to the cabin's rear, where a figure in a dark coat had stood up, his silhouette obscured by the dimness. The man's hand rested on the back of his seat, fingers curled around a small, metallic object that caught a glint of the emergency lighting. The attendant's expression hardened, a flash of recognition sparking across her face, but she kept her composure, moving to the galley with a purposeful stride. Maya's grip on the notebook tightened, the leather creaking as if protesting. Declan's posture shifted, the wolf's instinct sharpening, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the movement of the mysterious figure. The storm outside battered the fuselage, a roar that seemed to vibrate through every seat, amplifying the tension that now pulsed like a living thing between them. "Someone's not happy with us," Declan whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine's roar. He leaned closer, the scent of rain-soaked pine intensifying as he exhaled, his breath a mist in the cool cabin air. Maya met his gaze, the vulnerability in her eyes matching the fire she'd tried to keep hidden. "Maybe it's just the weather," she replied, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She glanced at the attendants retreating back, the glint of her pin catching the light as if warning of danger. A muffled thump resonated from the galley, the sound of metal clanking against metal, followed by a brief, sharp intake of breath from a passenger. The cabin held its breath, the storm outside a deafening roar that seemed to mute everything else. Declan's hand slipped from the notebook's cover, his fingers brushing the edge of his own cuff where the hidden blade was concealed. He felt the faint pull of the metal, a promise of protection he had kept hidden for years. "Stay calm," he murmured, more to himself than to Maya, his tone a low reminder that he was still in control, even as the fear of losing autonomy gnawed at the edges of his resolve. He placed his hand gently over the notebook, the leather warm from his skin, a silent pledge that he would not let the external chaos dictate the safety of the fragile connection they'd begun to forge. Maya's breathing steadied, the rhythm of the engine syncing with the thrum of his heartbeat. She lifted her eyes to the window, where a bolt of lightning illuminated the clouds in stark, white clarity, then vanished, leaving a momentary glow that painted the cabin a pale, ghostly hue. In that flash, she saw something in the distance, a flicker of movement on the wing, a shadow that seemed to hover just beyond the metal, a hint of a presence that could be either threat or salvation. She turned back to Declan, the notebook now a shield between their bodies, a barrier they were both willing to let slip. "I think," she said softly, "that the storm outside isn't the only thing we need to navigate." Her hand lingered over the edge of his briefcase, tracing the embossed wolf, a tactile connection that said more than words could. He exhaled a breath that smelled of pine and rain, his eyes reflecting the dim cabin light. "And the lane we're in," he replied, "is full of unseen obstacles." He glanced at the attendant again, the woman's stare now fixed on the dark coat in the galley, attention building like a coiled spring. "You're not the only one who's holding onto something that could break." Maya's smile was thin, but her eyes glittered with a resolve that mirrored his own. "Then let's make sure we don't break each other." She closed the notebook, the leather snapping shut with a soft thud, sealing away the day's schedule and the hidden fears it represented, at least for the moment. The cabin lights dimmed further, the soft amber glow giving way to a cooler white as the plane descended into the drizzle that awaited them on the runway. The turbulence eased, the metal of the fuselage settling into a smoother hum, and the flight attendant returned, her expression now a mask of professional calm. But the way her fingers trembled as she placed a napkin on Maya's tray suggested a secret she was still weighing. Declan stood, his briefcase sliding out with a quiet click, his coat swinging slightly as he moved toward the exit row. He paused, turning back to Maya with a look that was both challenge and invitation. "We have a few more hours before we land," he said, voice low, "if you're willing to share more of that notebook." She opened the cover again, the worn leather creaking under her fingertips. The page she chose was blank, a stretch of untouched paper waiting for words. "Maybe," she said, a smile finally softening fully, "we'll write something together." Her hand reached out, the pen poised, the ink glistening like a promise in the dim cabin light. He took the pen, his grip firm yet gentle, the metal cool against his palm. As his fingers brushed the paper, a subtle prickle ran through his skin, the familiar sensation of the wolf's presence tingling at the edges of his consciousness, warning him that the night's events were far from over. He glanced at the window, the rain now steady patter against the fuselage, and felt a strange comfort in the rhythm, as if the storm's cadence matched the heartbeat of the secret world they both inhabited. The attendant's eyes lingered on the two of them a moment longer before she turned away, the suspicion in her gaze still flickering, perhaps waiting for the next move in a game she could not yet see the rules of. Meyer and Declan continued to write, the pen moving across the page, each stroke a step toward a future that felt both inevitable and terrifying, the storm outside echoing the unspoken promise that the proximity that had forced them together would now become the crucible in which they forged something neither had imagined. The plane shuddered again, a sudden dip that made the tray in my lap wobble, spilling a thin line of broth onto the napkin. I blinked, the steam curling around my forearms, and felt Declan's hand tighten on the armrest beside me, his knuckles whitening. His eyes flicked to the cabin lights, then back to the window where the storm painted the clouds in jagged white. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the sound more animal than human, and I caught the faint metallic tang of his breath mingling with the pine of his jacket. "Something's moved in the galley," he whispered, the words barely cutting through the engine's drone. He leaned forward, the cuff of his shirt catching the dim light, revealing a flash of steel under the fabric. My heart thudded against my ribs, the notebook's leather cover suddenly heavy in my hands, as if it were a shield I could push against whatever was coming. The flight attendant, a woman whose eyes still flared with that predator's gleam, glided past our row, her steps silent on the carpet. She dropped a folded napkin on my tray and, without looking, brushed a finger over the pin at Declan's lapel. The gesture lingered, a brief pause that made the air taste of copper. I watched the flicker of recognition in Declan's gaze, the way his jaw tightened, and a cold sweat slipped down my spine. A sudden clang echoed from the galley, the sound sharp as a knife being drawn. Declan's shoulders tensed, his hand sliding beneath his jacket. I felt the pressure of his palm on the back of my seat, a silent promise, yet his fingers trembled. The storm outside flared, a bolt of lightning slashing the horizon, and the cabin lights flickered, casting our silhouettes into a brief, stuttering tableau. "Stay seated," he said, voice slow, but the edge in his tone betrayed the certainty I'd been reading into his words. He didn't move. Instead, he pressed his palm harder, as if anchoring himself to the metal frame rather than to me. The notebook slipped from my grip, a page fluttering open to a blank space where I had intended to write tomorrow's schedule. My pen rolled onto the tray, clattering against the cup, and for a heartbeat I imagined it spelling out a warning I hadn't yet understood. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my cardigan, a vibration that sounded like a heartbeat out of sync with the plane's thrum. I glanced at the screen, a text from the Whitmore's lawyer, terse, demanding my immediate return. The deadline burned in my mind, the promise of losing the job tightening around my throat like a rope. I swallowed, the taste of metal rising, and forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Looks like we're both stuck with a deadline," I murmured, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. Declan's stare lingered on my notebook, then drifted to the doorway where the attendant stood, her hand hovering near the galley's edge. In that moment, the proximity that had felt like a bridge snapped into a chasm. I felt the old habit rise, the instinct to pull back, to hide behind my schedules and notes, to protect the fragile safety net I'd built. The storm rumbled louder, and I wondered whether the real turbulence was about to erupt inside the cabin or inside us. Maya pressed the leather cover of the notebook against her chest as the plane's wheels kissed the tarmac, the sudden jolt sending a shiver up the seam of the seatbelt. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber, the rain outside pattering against the fuselage in a steady, almost rhythmic tap. She could feel the wet air seeping through the tiny cracks around the door, a coolness that clung to her skin like someone had brushed her wrist with a cold hand. The flight attendant lingered a moment longer, her eyes flicking to the pin on Declan's lapel. Then she turned and slipped down the narrow aisle, the click of her heels a faint metronome against the hum of the engines winding down. Maya's fingers trembled around the edge of the notebook, the worn leather softening under her grip as if it recognized the weight of what she was about to do. She stared at the page where the pen had stuck, the ink a dark pool that mirrored the storm outside. The words she had written moments before, deadline, Whitmore's lawyer, return, or lose everything, seemed to dissolve into a thin ribbon of smoke when she looked at them now. The pressure in her chest tightened, a knot forming at the base of her throat, the same knot that always appeared whenever she felt the first sting of abandonment. She inhaled, the scent of lavender from the sachet in her cardigan blooming against the metallic tang of the aircraft, and forced herself to glance across the aisle. Declan was already standing, his coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the faint line of his wrist scar glinting under the low light. He moved with a controlled precision, the briefcase sliding from the seat with a soft, almost reverent sigh as it found the floor. The silver wolf pin on his lapel caught the cabin's dim glow, a flash that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He glanced at the door, his eyes narrowing as a gust of cold rain washed over the open aircraft, droplets scattering across the polished metal like 1,000 tiny mirrors. He caught a glimpse of Maya's face, the way she had clenched the notebook so tightly that the leather creaked, and he felt a familiar flicker deep in his gut, a mix of protectiveness and something that felt dangerously like vulnerability. He stepped forward, the heel of his shoe making a soft thud against the carpeted aisle, and when he reached her, his hand rested lightly on the back of her seat, the fingers barely touching the leather. The contact was brief, but it sent a current through her, the sensation of warm skin against cool metal, a reminder that his presence was more than just proximity. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the ambient noise, a low murmur of other passengers gathering their things, the distant hiss of the rain fill the space between them. Maya drew a slow breath, feeling the air fill the back of her throat, the lavender scent mingling with the faint smell of pine that seemed to linger on his jacket. She tilted her head, the movement causing a strand of her hair to fall across her cheek, and she tapped the notebook with her thumb, the rhythm matching the beat of her pulse. "You still have that blade," she said, her voice low, the sarcasm thinly veiled beneath a veneer of curiosity. Declan's eyes flicked to the cuff of his shirt, where a glint of steel peeked from beneath the fabric. He let out a soft, humorless chuckle that sounded more like a warning than a laugh. A habit, old enough to have learned not to pull it unless necessary. He let his fingers linger a fraction longer on the seam of his coat, a small gesture that told her he was aware of every detail of his own armor. "I've been keeping a lot of things hidden, some for safety, some because I'm scared that showing them will make them real." She stared at the scar on his wrist, the faint line that had once been a fresh wound now a faded river on his skin. The memory of the moment when his hands had brushed the edge of her notebook, the way his thumb had traced it as if measuring the weight of her secrets, flickered back to her. She felt the old reflex to pull away, to retreat behind the list of schedules and duties that had always kept her grounded. But something else, something she could not name, perhaps the very scent that had whispered destiny the moment they first met, held her forward. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing," she admitted, the words slipping out in a hushed tone that seemed too small for the cavernous space. Her gaze dropped to the page where she had scribbled the deadline reminder, then rose again to catch his eyes. "My job, if I don't get back in time, I lose everything. But if I stay, I'm staying with someone I barely know, and I'm scared that the moment I trust, I'll lose what little I have left." He nodded, the movement deliberate, the muscles in his jaw tightening then relaxing. I've spent my whole life leading a pack, telling everyone to follow my steps, never to question the path. The moment I think about letting someone in, I fear I'll become a puppet to my own expectations. He shifted his weight, the leather of his jacket whispering against the seat. The war with the sable packet's not just about territory, it's about keeping the balance, and if I'm compromised, everything could fall apart. He paused, the weight of his confession hanging between them like a held breath. I can't promise that I'll be free of that. I can't promise I won't pull back when the pressure mounts. Maya's hand tightened around the notebook, the leather creaking under the strain. She glanced at the rain-slicked windows, the world outside a blur of gray, the droplets racing each other down the glass. She thought of the twins, of their endless needs, of the way their mother's voice would crack when she called Maya's name, the way her mother had once told her, "You're the only one who can keep them together." The memory was a knot in her stomach, a reminder of the responsibility that had always defined her. Yet here, in the cramped aisle of a storm-laced plane, a different kind of responsibility was pressing against her ribs, the choice to open herself to someone who might have to protect her with a feral strength she barely understood. She lifted her chin, the line of her jaw firming, and set the notebook gently on the seat beside her. Maybe we can try to be honest, even if it feels like we're walking on a tightrope. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the motion small but deliberate, as if she were fastening a strap on a life-preserving harness. I can share a bit of my world with you, show you the notes I keep, the schedules that keep me breathing, and if you're willing, maybe I could learn a little about yours. Her voice wavered just enough to reveal the fear beneath the bravado. Not the pack politics, not the war, but the person behind the suit. A faint rustle came from the overhead bin as a passenger stood to retrieve a coat, the fabric brushing against the metal and letting out a muted sigh. The sound seemed to punctuate his next words. Declan shifted, the briefcase sliding forward, the hidden compartment catching a faint click that resonated like a secret being unlocked. He looked down at his hands, the veins standing out in the dim light, and then back up, his eyes softening. "I'll show you my notebook too." He pulled a slim black folder from his coat pocket, the leather cap smooth, the edges worn from use. He placed it on the seat, the weight of it a silent promise. "It's not as organized as yours, but it has the things that matter: names, dates, the people I'm responsible for, the things I can't forget." He opened it cautiously, revealing a series of handwritten entries, the ink a dark, purposeful line that seemed to map a life lived in shadows. "You'll see why I keep a blade under my cuff." He lifted his sleeve just enough for her to glimpse the faint metal edge, the cold glint reflecting the cabin lights. "It's not just for protection, it's a reminder that I'm still human." Maya leaned forward, the scent of pine and rain mingling with the lavender, the air thick with the metallic tang of the aircraft's circuitry. She traced a finger lightly over the top of the folder, feeling the slight ridge of the embossing, the subtle texture of a life's worth of secrets. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission barely louder than the hum of the engines winding down. "But I'm also tired of hiding in the margins." She turned the page of her own notebook, the paper smooth under her fingertips, and wrote a quick line. "Tomorrow find a way to be more than a caregiver." The pen left a faint scar on the page, a physical reminder of a decision made in the moment. "Let's try to keep each other from falling." She tucked the pen back into the pocket of her cardigan, the metal click echoing a tiny, hopeful clang. The cabin lights flickered again, a brief stutter that seemed to pause time for a heartbeat. Outside, a flash of lightning illuminated the wing, casting a brief, stark white across the rows of seats. The rain intensified, the sound of droplets striking the fuselage like a drumroll. Declan's ears, hidden beneath his hair, twitched at the change in atmosphere, a reflex he barely remembered having. He placed his hand gently over the notebook's cover, the warmth of his palm seeping through the leather, the pressure steady and reassuring. "We have a few more hours before we land," he said, his voice lower, more intimate than before. the words carrying an unspoken promise that he'd stay beside her despite the impending chaos outside and the war that loomed beyond the horizon. Maya nodded, the muscle in her throat easing just enough for her to exhale a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The vague anxiety that had coiled around her heart began to unspool, replaced by a tentative steadiness. She looked at the woman in the aisle who had been watching them, the attendant whose stare still lingered on the pin, a flicker of doubt or perhaps a calculation crossing her face. Maya's mind drifted momentarily to the silver dagger she had glimpsed in the galley, wondering who had placed it there and why. She felt a prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation of an unseen presence watching, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the quiet connection forming between her and Declan. The plane's descent slowed, the wheels settling onto the runway with a deep, resonant thud that reverberated through the cabin floor. The rain outside turned from a steady patter to a heavy downpour, the sound a constant drumbeat that seemed to echo the rhythm of their newly forged pact. Declan stood, his briefcase sliding out with a soft click, the leather of his coat whispering as he moved toward the exit row. He turned back, his gaze meeting Maya's with a look that was both challenge and invitation, a silent question hanging in the air. Would she step out of the safety of her notebook and follow him into a world she barely understood? Maya rose as well, the notebook slipping from her lap but catching on the edge of the seat, the leather cover shaking slightly before settling. She brushed it off with a swift, practiced motion, the sound of the leather brushing the seat back a soft, reassuring rustle. She tucked the black folder into her own bag, the weight of it a new, unexpected comfort against her hip. "Let's get off this thing," she said, her tone steadier now, the sarcasm replaced by a quiet resolve. "And then we figure out the rest." She paused, the rain applause against the fuselage a steady backdrop, and added, "One step at a time." The words felt like a promise she could hold onto, a line she could return to when the storm inside grew louder. He offered his hand, the fingers strong yet gentle, the metal cuff on his wrist catching a glint of the cabin's soft light. She placed her hand in his, the warmth of his palm against hers a grounding force, the texture of his skin reminding her that she was no longer alone in the cabin's cramped space. The flight attendant, still lingering near the galley, glanced at the two of them, her eyes flickering with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, a silent question about what the next move would be. Maya didn't notice her focus on the hand she now held, the future that stretched beyond the flight like a road hidden beneath the rain. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal brushed against them, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, the sweet tang of pastries, and the lingering metallic tang of the aircraft's interior. Declan tightened his grip just enough to convey steadiness without strangling. Maya's notebook, now clutched under her arm, felt lighter than it had ever been, as if the act of sharing its contents had taken some of its weight away. She glanced at the black folder peeking from her bag, feeling a subtle shift in her chest, a combination of anxiety, hope, and an unfamiliar anticipation. The doors opened to a world washed in rain, the runway lights blurring into ribbons of amber through the droplets that fell like translucent beads. The sable pack's presence lingered only as a phantom in Maya's mind, a question mark hovering over the silver dagger she had seen, the attendant's strange glint, the unseen operative's possible motives. Declan's thoughts raced through possible strategies, alliances, debts, and the looming peace talks that weighed on his shoulders. Yet, for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to focus on the present, on the thin line of connection forming between them, on the fact that he had chosen to stay, to protect, to share his hidden folder. They walked side by side toward the terminal exit, the wet pavement slick underfoot, the rain splashing in concentric circles around their shoes. The sound of their steps merged with the distant rumble of the storm, a rhythm that matched the low thrum still resonating in their chests. Maya felt a new resolve settling in, one that didn't come from a schedule or a list, but from a decision she made in the cramped aisle, to let someone else see the pages she had kept hidden for so long. Declan, in turn, felt the familiar pull of duty loosen just enough to make room for something else, a partnership that might balance his need for autonomy with the comfort of shared burden. The terminal's glass doors brushed open, the fresh rain gusting in, the world beyond a blur of gray and neon. Their steps fell into sync, the space between them no longer an empty aisle but a bridge they had chosen to cross together. Even as the storm raged on outside and the hidden threats of packs and daggers waited in the shadows of a city that never truly slept. The cabin lights flickered again, stuttering like a dying pulse, and the hiss of rain against the fuselage grew louder, as if the storm wanted to drown every sound inside. I tightened the strap of my bag, the leather notebook pressing hard against my ribs, and felt the weight of the pen inside my palm, cold, unyielding, a reminder that I could still write something, even if the words were tangled. Declan was already standing, his coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the faint scar that traced his wrist, a thin river of old blood that caught the dim light. He moved with a precision that made the seatbelt buckles click into place with a soft, metallic sigh, and I could hear the faint scrape of his shoes against the carpeted aisle. The attendant, a woman whose eyes still glinted with a predator's memory, lingered near the galley, fingers hovering over the silver dagger she had slipped back into the napkin stack. She glanced at Declan, then at the pin on his lapel, her lips parting barely for a breath. "Someone's trying to make a statement," she murmured, voice low enough that only the row behind her could hear. Her words drifted toward me, a waft of citrus perfume cutting through the pine scent that clung to Declan's jacket. I could see the tension coil in his throat, a tremor that made his jaw muscles twitch. "Do you know why they're after you?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could weigh it. My voice sounded thin, the same thinness that always rose when I tried to keep a conversation from sliding into the place where I confessed my fears. He slowed, the distance between us shrinking to a breath. His hand hovered over the edge of his briefcase, fingers brushing the polished metal of the hidden compartment. A low growl throbbed in his chest, but his face stayed composed, the only crack in his mask a flicker of amber in his eyes. "They think I'm the key to opening a war they've been nursing in the shadows," he said, each word measured, the syllables landing like stones in a quiet river. "The Sable Pack believes I can be forced to bend, to hand over the ley line district." I sucked in a breath, the lavender sachet in my cardigan releasing a soothing note that clashed with the metallic tang of the plane's circuitry. My mind raced to the schedule I'd scribbled earlier: pick up at 6:30, the Whitmore twins' birthday cake, the lawyer's ultimatum, each line now a thread pulling me back to a life that demanded my exactness. I could feel the notebook wobble against my chest, the leather straining as if it wanted to slip away. "The war isn't my problem," I said, the sarcasm sharp as the edge of a blade. "I'm just a nanny who can't afford to miss a shift." His eyes hardened, the amber flash in them sharpening. "Your world and mine are colliding," he replied, voice low, the sound resonating in the cramped space. "If I let you in, you'll become a target. You'll be dragged into a battle that could cost you everything you've built." A shiver ran down my spine, not from the cold metal of his cuff, but from the memory of my mother's hands, calloused and steady, telling me that people who tried to protect you often ended up pulling the ground from under you. The flight attendant's hand slipped from the galley door, a subtle click indicating she had retrieved the dagger, and the blade caught a glint of the cabin's amber light. I saw the reflection in Declan's eyes, a primal warning that something was about to snap. "Are you saying I should walk away?" My words were barely a whisper, but the tremor in my voice was obvious, the same tremor that rose whenever I heard a promise of abandonment. My fingers tightened around the pen, the plastic grip biting into my skin like a tiny fist. He swallowed, the sound a dry rustle. "I can't promise you safety," he said, the words a barricade he was forced to raise. "And I can't be the one who keeps you tied to a fate you never asked for. My pack needs me whole, and I fear." His throat clenched, his hand slipping to the scar on his wrist as though it could rewrite the pain it held. "I fear losing myself if I let anyone else in. I've been the alpha because no one else would take it, because I'm the only one who can hold the line. If I let you into that line, I become a pawn to a destiny I never chose." The attendant stepped forward, her eyes snapping to the hidden dagger now resting conspicuously against the side of the galley counter. She brushed a fingertip over the metal, the contact leaving a faint smear of oil on the steel. I caught the smell of rust mixed with a faint scent of coffee from the trolley that passed moments before, an odd reminder that ordinary life kept moving even as my world tilted. "We've both been hiding things," I said, letting the words tumble out. "I hide my schedule, you hide a blade and a pack. But we both wear masks that keep us from falling." He exhaled, the breath carrying pine and rain, and for a heartbeat I thought he might soften. Instead, his jaw tightened, the scar on his wrist pulsing like a bruise. "You think my fear of losing autonomy is the same as my fear of being used?" he asked, voice edged with accusation. "I'm not an orphan of circumstance, Maya. I chose this burden. If I step back, the pack fractures, the war erupts, and the city burns." The plane shuddered, a sudden dip that sent the tray on my lap tilting, spilling a thin line of broth onto the napkin. The liquid soaked into the paper, darkening the spot where I had just written deadline. My heart hammered against my throat, each beat a drum that matched the engine's low rumble. The attendant's hand lingered on the dagger a beat longer, then she slipped it into her pocket, a subtle motion that suggested she might still have a purpose beyond simple service. "I can't be a liability," I whispered, voice cracking like a cracked window pane. "If I stay, I'm pulling you into my chaos. If I go, I lose the chance to be more than a caretaker." He stared at the broken line of broth, the ink smudging, the words bleeding into the page. A long silence settled, the only sounds the rain drumming the fuselage and the faint hum of the plane's systems. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the notebook, the leather glistening under the dim light. "I could leave you here," he said, each syllable deliberate, the tone flat but heavy. "I could let you go back to Manhattan, to your schedule, to your safety. Or I could keep you, and risk pulling you into a war that will consume everything you fought to build." The question hung, a blade poised above a throat. I could feel the sweat on my palms, the notebook's edges digging into my skin as if it wanted to stay bound to me, to keep me tethered to the life I knew. The attendant, now a phantom in the aisle, glanced once more at Declan's pin, her eyes narrowing, a secret calculation flickering behind her stare. A sudden jolt rocked the aircraft, the lights flickering, the cabin trembling as if the storm outside had found a way inside. My notebook slipped from my grasp, fluttering open to a page I hadn't yet filled. The blank space stared back, an abyss where my future should be. Declan's hand brushed the edge, his thumb leaving a faint imprint of oil, a reminder that even his touch could mark me. "Maybe we're both scared of the same thing," I said, my voice steadier now, the fear of abandonment morphing into something sharper, fear of being the one who pulls the other down. "Maybe we've both been running from the idea that we can ever truly belong." He looked at me, the amber in his eyes dimming, his hand retracting from the notebook. "I can't promise you a peace I don't have," he whispered, the words raw, stripped of the polished veneer I'd come to expect. "And I can't stay if it means I'm the chain that holds you back." The attendant's foot brushed the galley door, a soft scrape that echoed like a sigh. A distant shout from the rear of the plane, "Ladies and gentlemen, we expect a brief delay," was swallowed by the storm's roar. I felt a sudden, involuntary step back, as if the plane itself urged me to retreat. My heart pounded, not from the turbulence but from the realization that the crossroads we'd arrived at was not a temporary detour but a permanent split. "I have to go back," I said, the words snapping like a snapped rubber band. "My job, my kids, my mother, they need me now. If I stay, I become a ghost in your war." My fingers brushed the notebook one last time, the leather cool against my skin. Then I let it fall onto the seat, the pen toppling over, clattering against the tray. Declan stood, his silhouette framed by the flickering cabin lights, the hidden blade catching the flash of amber. He reached for his coat, the fabric rustling like dry leaves. Then I'll keep my promise to the pack, he said, voice low, the steel of his resolve clashing with the tremor in his hand. And I'll keep you out of it. The attendant moved past us, her eyes lingering on the dagger now concealed within her bag, the metal glint catching a stray beam of light, an unanswered question about who else was watching, who else might intervene. Behind her, a man in a dark coat slipped a folded note into his pocket, his eyes darting to Declan, then to the aisle, a silent alarm that something else was moving in the shadows of this already tangled flight. The plane finally began its descent, the wheels grinding against the rain-slick runway with a deep, resonant thud that vibrated through my bones. The cabin filled with a soft murmur of passengers gathering their belongings, the scent of recycled air mingling with the iron taste of wet metal. I stood, my bag slung over my shoulder, the notebook still open on the seat, a half-written line of tomorrow find a way to be more than a caregiver lingering in the ink. Declan placed his hand briefly on my elbow, a pressure that felt both like a promise and a warning. "Take care of yourself, Maya," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine wind down. "And if you ever need a place to hide, you know where to find me." I wanted to say more, to ask him about the folder he'd hidden, the names he'd written, the war that loomed beyond the clouds. Instead, I nodded, the motion small, my throat tight with a mix of relief and loss. The attendant's stare followed us down the aisle, her gaze lingering on the silver pin of the wolf on Declan's lapel, a reminder that the pack's eyes were everywhere. As the doors opened and the rain poured in, the cold wind slapped my face, carrying with it the scent of wet pavement, fresh coffee from a terminal cafe, and a distant siren that seemed far away yet ominously close. I stepped onto the jet bridge, the notebook still clutched in my hand, its pages blank where I had hoped to write us a future. The storm outside raged on, but inside the plane the quiet after the chaos felt worse, a hollow that no forced proximity could ever fill again. The rain slicked the terminal pavement in a glossy sheet, each puddle catching the neon blur of exit signs and reflecting the twin halos of my worn leather notebook and the black folder tucked in my bag. I walked past the sliding doors, the scent of freshly brewed espresso from a kiosk mixing with the metallic bite of the air conditioning ducts, and the distant static of a public address system announcing gate changes that no one seemed to need. My shoes thudded against the tile, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse in my temples, while the notebook's pages brushed my thigh with each step, the leather whispering like a reminder not to let the day's notes dissolve into the night. I paused at the information board, the digital clock flickering a red 12:03, and caught a glimpse of a woman in a navy uniform gliding toward the arrival's gate. The attendant's bun was immaculate, but her eyes lingered a fraction too long on the metal pin at my side, the wolf's head catching the fluorescence like a silent alarm. My hand tightened around the notebook's strap, the worn leather creasing under my grip. I could still feel the ghost of her stare, a prickle of something that was more than curiosity, perhaps suspicion, perhaps a warning. I turned away before I could see where she headed, and the backpack on the carousel clanged with the thud of a suitcase I didn't recognize, the tag bearing a name I'd never heard. My mind catalogued the oddity, a loop that twanged at the back of my head like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. The taxi line stretched, a serpentine queue of chrome and neon, and I slipped into a cab that smelled of pine cleaner and cheap leather. The driver, a middle-aged man with a faded NYC tattoo on his forearm, nodded at me without words, his eyes flicking to the notebook as I placed it on his seat. "Where to?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that blended with the rain tapping the windshield. I said the address of the Whitmore townhouse, the syllables feeling like a stop sign after a long drive. As we pulled onto the wet streets, the city's skyline stared back through a curtain of gray, the high-rise windows reflecting a storm that had not yet passed. I watched the world blur past, the streetlights turning into elongated bands of amber, each one a reminder of the schedule I'd left behind: pickup at 6:30, bedtime story at 7:15, the lawyer's call at 8:00. The coordinate of my life felt like a map I'd been tracing with a ruler, the edges all too sharp. The cab halted at the Whitmore entry, the driver's hand resting on the gear shift as he waited for the door to open. I stepped out, the rain seeping through the hem of my cardigan, the lavender sachet in my pocket releasing a calming puff that contrasted with the cold drizzle. The twins' mother greeted me with a tight smile, her eyes darting to the clock on the hallway wall, the faint ticking a metronome to my heartbeat. She handed me a thin envelope, the paper thick enough to crunch when I unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note. Maya, we need you. The twins have a fever. Please come in now or I'll have to call the agency. My fingers traced the ink, the pressure of the pen against the paper mirroring the pressure I'd felt in the cabin, the need to be needed, the dread that if I slipped, I'd be abandoned by the only people who paid me. I went straight to the nursery, the scent of disinfectant sharp against the lingering pine from the jacket I'd left on the seat. The twins lay in their cribs, their tiny chests rising and falling in a rhythm that reminded me of the engine's low hum, and the mother hovered, her hands clasped around a cup of tea that steamed in the cold air. I lifted the blanket gently, feeling the thinness of the fabric, and the fevered skin of their foreheads, a heat that rose like a warning light. My mind catalogued each symptom, each lullaby I'd sung in the past, each moment I'd fought to keep the schedule unbroken. The fear that had always whispered when I grew close to anyone, fear of being left when the need vanished, tightened like a band around my chest. I could watch the twins recover and be praised, or I could step back, let the agency decide my fate. The decision didn't need anyone else, it sat in the pulse of my own hands. I chose to stay. I checked their temperature, the digital beeper chirping a rapid cadence, and called the agency through the wall unit, my voice steady despite the tremor in my throat. I'm here, I said. I'll handle it. The woman on the other end sounded relieved, then asked, "Can you bring the medicine?" I heard the faint click of the cabinet door opening, the rustle of a bottle being lifted, the clink of a glass as she measured a dose. My fingers moved automatically, the pen from my pocket slipping into my palm as I wrote a quick note about dosage, the ink drying like a small promise. When the mother thanked me, her gratitude was a soft sheen, almost a mirror of the way I'd felt when someone praised my meticulous lists. I realized that the notebook had become less a shield and more a bridge, still a tool, but now a conduit for me to articulate care without losing myself. The fear of abandonment was still there, but it was no longer a void that demanded I cling. It was a quiet voice reminding me to set boundaries, to ask for help when the fever rose higher than my own capacity. I left the house with the twins' mother's thanks echoing in the hallway, the rain now a steady drizzle that fell in straight lines down the windows of the car I'd taken back to the street. My phone buzzed, a text from the agency. "Good work. We'll schedule you for next week, same shift." I stared at the message, the glow of the screen reflecting off the wet asphalt, and felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the knot that had always tied my identity to the next task. I could still be the reliable caretaker, but I no longer needed to be defined solely by it. The notebook, now tucked under my arm, felt lighter, its pages humming with possibility. Across town, Declan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the glass railing cool against his fingertips, the rain splattering against the steel frames like distant drums. The city stretched below, streetlights flickering in the downpour, the scent of wet concrete rising with the wind. He watched a black sedan pull up, its driver stepping out with a briefcase that matched the one he'd left in the plane. A figure in a dark coat emerged, eyes hidden beneath a brimmed hat, and slipped something into the pocket of the attendant's coat as she hurried past the building's entrance. Declan's jaw clenched, the amber flash in his eyes dimming as he recognized the familiar pattern, a subtle exchange, a silent warning. He turned back to his own balcony, the curtain of rain blurring the skyline, and let the silence settle over him like snow. He opened the black folder he'd brought from the flight, the leather cap soft from use, and lifted the first page. It was a list of names, dates, and cryptic symbols, entries he'd recorded in a rush of meetings and clandestine gatherings. The ink bled slightly where his hand had trembled, the letters jagged like a heartbeat. He traced a line that read Pack Council Secure Ley Line District. the words a reminder of the war looming, the weight of leadership pressing on his shoulders. He could feel the old scar on his wrist, the faint line still visible under the cuff, a reminder of a fight won and a wound that never fully healed. He thought of Maya's notebook, the way her pen had moved across paper with purpose, and wondered if his own notes could ever convey more than strategy, if they could hold his own doubts, his fear of being a pawn to others' expectations. He set the folder aside and walked into the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the pine that lingered on his coat. He poured a cup, the steam rising in thin ribbons that smelled of rain-drenched wood, and leaned against the counter, the cool marble grounding his thoughts. He stared into the dark liquid, the surface rippling with the faint orange of the city lights reflected through the window. He could hear the low growl of his own chest, a primal rhythm that reminded him of the pack's expectations, but also of the freedom he'd once felt when he was just a boy chasing the wind on the outskirts of the industrial district. The memory of a summer storm, lightning striking a lone oak, the way the wind had lifted his hair, those sensations were tucked away, still alive, waiting for him to acknowledge them. He reached for his phone, a message flashing, "Need you at the council meeting, urgent." He stared at it, feeling the pressure in his fingertips, the urge to reply instantly, to confirm his presence, to fulfill the role he'd been thrust into. But his thumb hovered, the vibration of the phone echoing the hum of the air conditioner. He thought of the moment on the plane when he pressed his palm against Maya's notebook, feeling the weight of her fears against his own. That contact hadn't solved his autonomy problem, but it had shown him the possibility of holding something else without losing himself. He realized that his fear wasn't just about being used, it was about losing the part of him that still whispered about walking alone under a storm, about hearing the wind without an audience. He set the phone down, the screen darkening, and stepped onto the balcony again. The rain fell harder now, each droplet a tap against the glass, the sound a metronome that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He lifted his hand, feeling the scar on his wrist, and pressed his thumb to the edge of the balcony rail, the cold metal biting into his skin. He breathed in the scent of rain-soaked pine, the same scent Maya had noticed, and exhaled, letting the breath carry away the compulsion to always be the alpha, the protector, the strategist. In that breath, he recognized a new choice, to allow himself to be a participant rather than a commander, to let the pack's needs coexist with his own desire for quiet moments that did not require a blade hidden beneath cuff. He turned away from the railing, his silhouette merging with the shadows of the balcony. The folder rested on the table, its pages still waiting to be filled, but he no longer felt compelled to fill every line with duty. A distant siren wailed, a reminder that the city never stopped, that the war would still hover like a storm cloud, that the attendant still watched from somewhere, that the dagger in the galley might one day find its purpose. Yet, in the space between the rain and his own pulse, Declan felt a sliver of something steadier than a pack's command, a personal resolve to balance leadership with self-care, to let his own fear of being bound become a guide rather than a cage. The night stretched, the rain's rhythm a constant undercurrent as both of us moved through our own streets, each holding a notebook, each holding a folder, each carrying a loop that still waited for a turn. The planes, the daggers, the whispers of packs all lingered beyond the immediate steps we took, promising that the storm was far from over, yet the first drops of personal change had already begun to settle. Maya pushes the glass door of the downtown cafe, the metallic jangle echoing against the rain-slick bricks. A faint trace of espresso swirls around her, mixing with the lingering pine of Declan's coat that still clings to the coat rack she leans against. She spots the black folder tucked under a chair, its leather worn like her notebook, and feels the weight of a decision settle deeper than any schedule. Declan slides into the seat opposite, his cuff catching the low amber from the pendant light. He doesn't offer a greeting, his fingers trace the edge of the folder as if measuring the promise. The waitress passes by, her eyes flicking to the silver wolf pin on his lapel before returning to the espresso machine, a subtle tension humming in the air. "Did you get the note from the Sable operative?" Meyer asks, watching a drizzle pattern form on the window pane, each drop a staccato against the glass. He pauses, the scar on his wrist tightening just enough to spell a question. It was a warning, not a threat. They want the ley line district before the council meets. His voice lowers, the storm outside pressing against the cafe's steel shutters like a distant growl. Maya slides the notebook onto the table, the leather cracking under the pressure of her palm. I could have left the twins' schedule untouched and taken the flight back to Manhattan. I could have vanished. She taps the page where she wrote, "Tomorrow find a way to be more than a caregiver." The ink is still wet in her mind. He slides a folded piece of paper from the folder onto the table, its corners crisp, the ink dark as midnight. I was going to hand this to the council and disappear. I thought the pack would keep me bound. He folds the paper again, the motion deliberate, then places it beside her notebook, the two objects humming like parallel lines waiting to converge. A phone buzzes on the counter, the screen flashing the agency's logo. Maya's thumb hovers, then retreats, the tremor in her wrist a silent acknowledgement that she no longer runs from a deadline. I'm done chasing deadlines that scare me away from whatever this is. She lifts her eyes, catching his amber stare, the air between them charged with the scent of rain-soaked pine and lavender. He reaches across, his hand resting lightly on the notebook's cover, the leather warm from his touch. I'm choosing to stay where I can protect you instead of protecting a title. The waitress returns, setting two steaming cups down, the steam curling like a question mark around their shoulders. Outside, a siren wails, the city's pulse quickening. In the corner, a shadowed figure watches the cafe through the rain-splattered glass, a flash of a silver dagger disappearing in the crowd. Meyer and Declan exchange a glance, the unspoken understanding that their storms are still far from over, but the decision to face them together is already made.